got started and already have 2 less minutes. So I have a long talk today that is going to have to squeeze into 40 minutes. So I'll do my best. Quick question before I get started. Who here is using or has ever used PHP? OK. Now, I can cross my fingers it's going to be a friendly crowd, even though not necessarily, right? I mean, OK, so I'll begin real quick with a slightly less formal introduction. So my name is Zeev Suraski. I have 3 daughters. That gives me an awesome excuse to do all sorts of interesting things with PHP elephants. Yeah, I do that. Sometimes I even let my daughters play with them. I'm a very serious amateur photographer. That's the way I travel. I don't overlight. I'm crazy about spicy food, probably to the level that it could be considered some sort of mental illness. I've been programming since the age of 12. I began with BASIC. Anyone here ever developed in BASIC? Anyone developing BASIC which wasn't Visual Basic? OK. We're comrades. And the last thing I did before the stuff that I'm going to talk about today was developing C++ CGIs, C++-based web applications, which you should never, ever do. It's really not a very good idea. But at the time, I was really proud of it. So we didn't come to talk here today about me. My talk is obviously about PHP. And I wanted to talk about the evolution that PHP underwent in the last 20 or so years from being... You find all sorts of interesting things when you look for images on Google Images. This is the one I like the most. And I want to begin this evolution in, not really in the beginning, because I wasn't there in the very beginning. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to begin with when I became acquainted with PHP. And initially, it was as an end user, probably like most of you guys. And we'll talk about 1997. I was working on, I was a student, computer science student, and my fellow student and myself had to hand in a computer science project. And back then, a pretty simplistic e-commerce application was considered kind of bleeding edge, and a 5-point, that's relatively high pointage, 5-point course in the university. And we obviously wanted to spend as little time on actually developing the project so that we have time for other things, more interesting things. And I knew about PHP 5 from work. I was, in parallel to being a student, I was working at an internet service provider. And even though I was doing some real stuff like C++ CGIs, I had a colleague of mine that was using PHP 5. I've never heard of it, and I didn't pay too much attention when my colleague was talking about this fancy thing using which you can develop applications very, very quickly. But when we needed to hand in this project, we needed to start working on it, I remembered that he had this really fast way to develop web applications. I asked him about it. He pointed me to it, and we looked at it, and it looked very suitable. So we picked PHP to be the basis of our project. And very quickly into the implementation, by the way, I should mention that we were the only 2 students to do that. There was a bunch of other students that were all using the queen of the web back then, Perl. And we decided to use PHP 5 because it would save us time. And the problem was that very quickly into the actual implementation, probably half an hour or so into the implementation, we bumped into a problem that we couldn't, for the hell of us, couldn't figure out what was going on. And it was the first probably 20 or 30 lines of code that we've ever written in PHP. And already we bumped into this problem, and we tried to move things out, to shovel things around, and to look at the docs, nothing. So at some point, we reached the conclusion that the language was supposed to understand it properly. It was giving us a parser, but for some reason, it was not understanding correct syntax. So at that point, because we were kind of acquainted with open source and PHPFI was open source, we decided to take a look under the hood. And I think that in general, taking a look at source code is kind of similar to taking a look under the hood of your car. I mean, it's available, it's out there. Usually you don't actually look, especially if it's a code that you've never written, and especially if it's a complex piece of code. But we wanted to try and do it anyway, and it was really complex. And after a while, we figured out where the general area of where the problem was. But it seemed to us that the way it was written was really awkward. We took a compilations techniques course the previous semester, and it looked kind of like, I don't know if there are any mechanics in the audience, but if you could tell what's wrong in this car. So it's kind of like you would take a look under the hood of your car, and instead of finding a nice engine under it, you would see like a couple of nice white mice trying to rotate the wheels. Now, I should mention at this point that the guy who wrote PHPFI, Rasmus Lerdorf, which presented here last year, he actually did a pretty amazing job. I mean, considering the fact that it was not architected correctly, it was working remarkably well. It was just, again, if you try to create a car by putting mice under the hood, I mean, if you manage to get actually a car moving, it would be pretty spectacular. At that point, we decided to do the only logical thing that a couple of students would do when they realized that they picked the wrong technology, and that is rewrite this technology. So instead of moving to Perl, like everyone else was using, we decided to see if we could fix it, and the only way to fix it was writing it from scratch. It's not that we really had a choice, because we actually started writing code only after probably a couple of months of working with our instructor and explaining to her why PHPFI was the brilliant decision, the brilliant technology to use, so we couldn't backtrack on it at this point. The good news is that while we were developing this e-commerce application, within a few months we already had what later became the basis of PHP 3, a full-fledged language that had, first of all, it didn't have this class of issues like PHPFI had. It wouldn't parse error on valid syntax, so at least it would be very unlikely for it to do so. And it also introduced most of the key tenets of the PHP language that we're familiar with today, including expressions, statements, function calls the way we know them. All of that didn't actually exist, at least not in any way that is similar in PHPFI 2. And we released it. Of course, we didn't do it on our own. We joined forces with Rasmus Lerdorf. The project became from a one-man show into a group effort. And in mid-98, we released PHP 3. At that point, something really unexpected happened. I don't think that any of us, neither Rasmus, nor Andy Gutmans, nor myself, or anyone else that was involved could have predicted it. It started becoming really popular. And we were getting statistics from a company named Netcraft that was kind of monitoring the web servers on the internet and providing us with feedback as to how many PHP servers they were finding every month. And the numbers were just kind of steadily going up, as you can see here. And with the exception of what happened in mid-1999, that there was this sudden dip, and we thought, okay, maybe now they're finally coming to their senses and they fixed the measurements. With the exception of this quick dip, it steadily grew more and more. And then we did another thing that I think all developers at some point when they create an important piece of code, and sometimes when they create an unimportant piece of code, would do. They realized they did it completely wrong the first time around. And for us, even though it was PHP 3, for us it was the first time around. And we realized that if I use the car analogy, we didn't replace these white mice with the real engine. It's more like we replaced them with a couple of rats. So yes, they have a lot more energy, they're bigger, they can probably run faster. I'm actually not sure about that, but I'm guessing. But still, that's not what you would want to have under the hood of your engine. For those of you interested as to what I mean by that, come see me after the presentation. I don't want to get too much into it. But it was really not, it was better architected than PHP FI2, but still far away from where it should have been. So almost immediately after PHP 3 came out, we started working on a whole new implementation of the engine. That was the basis of PHP 4. And PHP 4, the main thing over there was performance. It was way, way faster than PHP 3. It was also, the reliability went up a notch. It wasn't that big of a difference like version 2 to version 3. But still, it was much more properly architected. In a way, even though it came out in year 2000, which is now, oh my God, 18 years ago, at a very high level, it's the same architecture as PHP 7 is today, the most recent version of PHP. And PHP kept on growing quite rapidly. So this graph kind of begins where the previous graph left. And you can see that the growth was steady and continued to grow and grow in the upcoming years. Thankfully, we didn't find oh my God, we should have done it completely different issue following the years after the PHP 4 release. But there was one element, and one, I would say, key element that we did get wrong, and this is object orientation. Object orientation exists since version, I'm actually not sure if it's 3 or 4. I believe it's 3, but it was definitely available in 4. And a lot of people were using it, but the reality of things that it was really a hack. It was a hack that I personally developed in one sleepless night, making arrays look nicer and fancier and giving them an object syntax, but it was really not the way object was supposed to behave. Without getting into too many details, for those of you who haven't been using PHP 4, in PHP 4 and earlier, objects were always passed by value and not by reference as they are in practically any other language. Think about it for a second and realize that this is really horrible, and indeed it was. And even though a lot of people were using objects in PHP 4, you couldn't really create sophisticated systems and sophisticated models using the object model of PHP 4. So this is the main thing that we tackled in PHP 5, and it was perhaps the one time since PHP 3 that we broke compatibility significantly by changing the behavior, changing the semantics of object orientation in PHP. It's not that people had to rewrite the code, but they did have to at least audit it and make sure that, that it's compatible with the new approach. Typically, make relatively small number of changes, but still, it wouldn't just work. That brings us to PHP 5, and finally, we had a high-resolution logo. That's another important element. You could see the transition, the evolution in logos as well. At that point, PHP was already extremely popular. You've seen the graphs, but there's also, in addition to the graphs, all of the websites that were using PHP, and it's impossible to even touch a tiny subset of them, but obviously Facebook was a prominent user, was and still is a prominent user of PHP. Wikipedia, a prominent user of PHP. Probably the one website that I'm the most proud that is using technology that I helped create. And of course, there were those projects that were by themselves becoming extremely popular and created ecosystems of their own, like WordPress, Magento, Drupal, and others. So all these websites using PHP and those applications that were becoming extremely popular and other indicators were pretty strong proof that PHP was extremely popular. Even though for me, the one thing that drove the point home really strong is when my wife and I went on a holiday on our honeymoon, sorry, to Argentina. And after a very long transatlantic flight, we checked into this small 3-star hotel in Buenos Aires. And as it's 2008, so you still kind of fill out a form with your name and passport number and all that. And I hand it in to the clerk, and he takes a look at it and types it into the computer. And when he gets to my name, he's like, Zeev Suraski? It's not my name is Zev, but close enough. Say yes. The PHP guy? It's like, yeah, okay. So that was so when a guy at the reception of a hotel halfway around the world knows your name and knows the technology that you've helped create, and actually was using it to create a social network for his neighborhood, San Telmo, that for me was perhaps the strongest scientific indicator that PHP was popular. And that brings us to PHP 7. Okay, so what's missing? PHP 6, right, so let's talk about the tragedy that was PHP 6. Not a real tragedy, I mean, nobody died, but it was a real project. It actually exists, you can check it out, like literally check the code out. Not that I recommend it, but you could do so if you want to. PHP 6 was essentially supposed to bring Unicode to PHP. It had just one tag. We didn't want to change anything else, just introduce Unicode into PHP. Now, PHP supported non-English character sets pretty much not from the beginning, but from very early on. It was very popular in Japan and in Korea and in other places, as well as in Europe, obviously. But it didn't support them natively. You needed to use special APIs to support, to access non-English character sets. And PHP 6 was supposed to bring Unicode as a first-class citizen in PHP, so that, for instance, if you use the API function str2upper, the lowercase ss will magically be understood and turned into an uppercase ss. Unfortunately, it was not meant to be. The project kind of lost steam because it was really complicated, probably because some of the decisions, some of the design decisions that we took. And in addition to losing steam, at some point, well into the project, we benchmarked PHP 5.3 at the time versus 6, and it wasn't a pretty sight. It was way slower, anywhere between 20 to 50% slower compared to PHP 5.3. And as a special bonus, it also roughly consumed twice as much memory, which is not a good thing in a server environment. And we decided to axe the project, and it died on a very specific second time, which I believe is when the email was sent. If you want to read more about it, for kind of PHP folklore, you can go to bit.ly/PHP what happened, PHP 6 what happened. And that finally does bring us to the topic of performance, which will lead us into PHP 7. I do want to quickly show you the performance evolution of PHP. Performance is something that mattered to us pretty much from the beginning, maybe with the exception of PHP 3. This is what things look like with PHP 3. By the way, that's low is better. That's the key here. So something that took 75 seconds to run in PHP 3 would take 12 seconds to run in PHP 4. And in 5.6, we already managed to push it down to just under 2 seconds. But what you can see here is that the jump from 5.0 to 5.1 was very substantial. And then there was some nice jump between 5.2 to 5.3. But after that, and maybe from 5.3 to 5.4, but after that, the performance gains kind of plateaued. We were not able to optimize PHP in a substantial way and to push the performance in a substantial way. And we figured out that in order to change that, we needed to do something more extreme. And it's not that at this point we thought, oh, okay, let's do PHP 7. What we wanted to do was obviously technology related, and that was introduce a technology called just-in-time. Just-in-time is essentially a technology that takes a language which does not get compiled into native code and compiles it into native code in real time. So to give you a couple of examples, C and C++ do compile into native code. Once you compile them into a binary, at a very high generalization, you don't need anything else. You have the binary and it turns, and that's it. It's already native code that the computer can understand as long as the operating system knows how to execute it. Java, on the other hand, does not compile into native code. It compiles into something called bytecode. And this bytecode needs a runtime environment to run. So at some level, it's dynamic. And no matter how you look at it, it's not native code. Java is one of the first languages, if not the first, to introduce just-in-time compilation in order to boost performance, so that instead of kind of interpreting the bytecode and executing on it, you would translate this bytecode into machine code. Machine code runs directly on the CPU, and it runs in the fastest way possible. We wanted to do the same with PHP, and we started working on it. It's a very complex task and requires remarkable knowledge, so it's not something that I worked on. It's a colleague of mine worked on. And the initial results were really encouraging, really upbeat, because the synthetic benchmark that we ran that does all sorts of interesting things like Fibonacci and sorting and all sorts of things that all of us do every day, especially in PHP. It was roughly 10 times faster. It was amazing. It was actually, and it's going to sound like a lie, but it's not. It was actually faster than a compiled C program. I can try to explain later if I have time how that is possible, but it is. Unfortunately, as we started making more progress and this new implementation was able to run something a bit more sophisticated than this synthetic benchmark, like WordPress, things were not just quite as happy. It didn't show any performance gains at all. So synthetic benchmarks were awesome, but WordPress, and we tested a few other things like Drupal afterwards, they didn't register any sort of performance improvement at all. Actually, the performance delta was anywhere between -2% to +2%, but not in a consistent way, and definitely not something to write home about. So at this point, we decided to, we spent already a lot of time, and we were not used to doing POCs, which did not eventually result in something useful. So we invested a lot of time in trying to understand why that was, and we had friends from Intel try to analyze the execution paths and the CPU load and all sorts of things like that. And we didn't really come to a conclusion, but we came to a theory. The theory was, what we could see is that we had a lot of cache misses, CPU cache misses. CPU cache misses, something that probably most of you don't have to worry about if you're developing at a higher level language, like PHP, like Java, like JavaScript. But if you're developing the language itself, it is something that you need to worry about, because cache misses slow things down very considerably. It means that the CPU has to go to the main memory, and the main memory, as of today, is still very, very slow compared to the memory on the CPU. And we came up with a theory that all we needed to do to fix it and to finally set the JIT technology free and actually get some performance gain out of it would be to go on a diet. Not this kind of diet, this kind of diet. It's not as colorful, but basically reduce the size of the data structures that PHP was using. And as funny as it may sound, maybe it does or maybe it doesn't, the biggest change is what you see there at the top, the 24 to 16 bytes. Even though it's only 8 bytes, that's the basic building block of pretty much anything in PHP, the Zen value. And our ability to shrink it from 24 bytes into 16 bytes was supposed to make a huge difference in terms of memory consumption, and it did. We also changed other elements of PHP. The other elements are not quite as popular, but still very, very common in the implementation of the PHP language. And again, we went through kind of the same process of, by the way, we had to put the JIT project aside. We didn't want to mix those two changes, and we figured that if we were able to make this, to go on this diet, we would then have to re-implement JIT on top of it. And we got to, again, to a situation where PHP was able to run a synthetic benchmark using those these updated data structures, and we got a nice, not quite as nice as JIT, but still more than twice as fast performance, which was kind of surprising to us because we didn't expect it to affect performance almost at all. Still, we were still kind of the unhappy dog faces because, you know, this was nice, but we already had some experience with synthetic benchmarks, and it wasn't really indicative of anything. But then we got to run WordPress again. We made some more progress, and WordPress was finally running, and suddenly we saw something really peculiar. WordPress, a reword app, was running much faster. Now, it was running about 50% faster just from going from those data structures going on this diet. And this was, again, surprising to us. It was all meant to be first step in order for us to then implement JIT on top of it. And this first step alone was making a huge difference, a much bigger difference than what the JIT project did beforehand. And we started testing it on other things, and we saw some really great performance boosts on pretty much across the board. So whether it's frameworks, object-oriented frameworks like Zen Framework or Laravel, whether you talk about applications like WordPress or Magento or Sugar or MediaWiki, all of them were running roughly twice as fast just from this diet and some additional optimizations that we added later on thanks to this new infrastructure. And that became the basis of PHP 7. Now, PHP 7 is kind of old news, but still, I think, to me, it's still quite exciting and not something that I recall pretty much anywhere in the technology world where just by upgrading your runtime, you're getting twice as fast performance. This is actually a graph from a case study that a company that moved from 5 to 7 published on their own. We didn't even have to kind of ask them to do that. So here you see that the company's name is Badu, so you can look it up, the Badu case study on moving to PHP 7. And they measured the performance metrics before and after they moved to PHP 7. You can take a wild guess on when exactly they moved. And the average memory consumption per request went down from almost 40 megabytes to just over 5. So the graphs are slightly misleading. It's not quite 0, not that good, but still roughly 7x better memory utilization, better memory consumption. That was huge. And in the same manner, this measures the load on the CPU. And it was halved as well, allowing them to literally turn off half of their servers after the migration and still actually get better response times. So that's PHP 7 for you. It was quite remarkable and still is. And if you're still using PHP 5, then you have all the reasons in the world to move to 7, in addition to the fact that PHP 5 goes out of support by the end of this year. So if you haven't done it already, it's time to do so. Some future directions that we're taking, because as I mentioned, PHP 7 is already a couple of years old. So there's been PHP 7.1, there's been PHP 7.2, and working on 7.3, but they're all kind of evolutionary steps. We are still, we have begun working on some more longer-term directions. And all of the things that I'm going to talk about today are not vaporware. We've already done some research into them at various levels. First, we've seen this slide before, JIT. So we have, after we went on this diet and we decided to not wait for JIT and we just pushed PHP 7 to the market just based on this much improved memory consumption, we decided that now was the time to see if the theory that JIT would yield much better real-world performance once we have a lot fewer CPU cache misses. We decided to see if it was true. Unfortunately, I can tell you that it's not true. So we did. PHP 7 was definitely not wasted time, and this effort was not wasted time because this by itself got us amazing performance gains. But we did re-implement JIT on top of PHP 7, on top of the PHP 7 code base, and still WordPress and Magento and so on barely moved the needle. It's slightly better than before. We were seeing something between 5 to 10% gains, but it's not quite the bombshell that you would want it to be. That said, this has to do specifically with kind of workloads that PHP uses today, and if and when people start using PHP for other types of workloads, then this can change. So what I want to show you now is a different kind of workload that I'm not so sure that most of you are doing, but still. Factors, real-time factor generation. So that's PHP 7. And that's still PHP 7 because I pressed the wrong button, but this is the JIT. So you can see it's a lot faster. And even with the huge head time that I gave PHP 7 and the mistake that I did by running it again, it already finished the benchmark about 16 frames per second, whereas the fast PHP 7 that we are talking about, that we have been talking about in the last couple of years, is still only about halfway through the benchmark and is doing running the exact same code at about 4 frames per second. So JIT is unlikely to make your web applications go faster, but it will allow you to create CPU-intensive code in PHP and run it very efficiently. As to what you're going to do with it, that's an interesting question that I don't really know the answer to yet, but PHP is going to become one of the, it already is the fastest non-JITted language out there today, and once we introduce JIT, it's going to become one of the fastest languages out of the JIT group that will be available. This is also very much related to another direction that we're working on, which is called FFI. That stands for Foreign Function Interface. And foreign function interface is essentially a way to easily create extensions, or I should say, to easily connect PHP to native code libraries. Today you can do it, but you need to be a C++ developer and write an extension. You need to learn a bit about the APIs of the engine of PHP and so on and so forth. And that's complicated. The average PHP developer probably doesn't have this experience or knowledge to do it, which is why PHP, even though it has a very nice selection of extensions, it's still probably in the level of less than 100 or maybe a couple of hundreds in total. With FFI, you can just define the interface to the native code library. You still probably need to be to have some level of knowledge of C or C++, but you don't actually need to write C code. And you are then able to connect PHP to this native code library. With that, of course, all of the native code libraries that are available out there in the areas of, just tiny selection here, big data, artificial intelligence, data science, and so on, become available to you. And I think that combined with JIT, you're going to be able to create some pretty sophisticated and very fast backend applications that today just don't make sense in PHP. which version it's going to be, whether it's going to be PHP 8 or we'll jump to PHP 10. I don't know, we'll see. Probably PHP 8. The last thing that we're searching into is microservices, and not really microservices, but actually making the architecture of PHP more suitable for microservices. And today, it's already possible to write services and microservices in PHP, but admittedly, the architecture of PHP, the way it was designed, was more geared towards fatter requests, and the initialization time, and to a degree also the cleanup time at the end, and the beginning and the end of each request are relatively high. So if you want to write real microservices, which are very, very fast and and you want to be able to handle a very large number of concurrent users, then the combination of PHP and Apache or PHP and Nginx are not the most efficient in the world. Most companies or most deployments don't bump into this issue. I mean, not everyone here is Google or Facebook that needs to be able to handle a billion different users at any given time. But still, it's nice to be able to do that if you want to. So we are researching into, and more than researching, we're experimenting into a different execution model that is more similar to that of Node.js. It's not going to replace the Apache PHP or Nginx PHP, the existing execution model, but if we manage to crack it, and I think we will, it's going to complement it. And it will allow you to create long-running processes in PHP, very similar to Node, that will have pretty much instant request initialization time and very quick cleanup time, and be able to handle a lot of different concurrent requests within a single process, and make PHP a lot more suitable to deploy high-performance microservices. And with that, I'd like to thank you and take questions if there are any. For those who are interested, I will be posting the slides on Twitter, so you'll be able to pick them up.
Thank you, thank you. All right, so we have a bunch of questions for you. The first one is, what is the best PHP framework in your opinion, and why? I think it's a trick one.
Yeah. So, of course, I'm completely objective when I say Zen framework. No. So there are actually two that I think you should look at. Even though there are a lot of good frameworks out there, today I think there are two you should look at. One is Laravel. It's probably the most... I mean, contrary to what some of you may be thinking, there's some good cross-pollination going on in PHP, and I wouldn't say I'm a close friend of Taylor Otwell, but I've met him a few times. He invited me to speak at LaraCon, so it's not that we all kind of out to kill each other or anything. So Laravel is one. The other one is a lot newer, and I think is very, very suitable for especially the world of microservices, and it's expressive. It's kind of the Zen framework reincarnated, and I think it's pretty awesome. So those are the two you should look at and choose for yourself.
Nice. Okay, will PHP 8 have better support for multi-threading?
So this is not something that I'm at least currently aware of that is planned. What we are going to do is, or we're going to try to do as a part of the last thing that I mentioned, though, those long-running processes that would do better microservices, that would allow for higher performance microservices, what that requires is essentially support across the board for asynchronous I/O. Multi-threading per se isn't something that I'm aware that anyone is looking into, but you would be able to, if we manage to do that, you will be able to run more than one piece of code more than one request or more than one piece of code of PHP in the same process at the same time, and they would juggle the CPU between them as one is waiting for I/O, the others will execute, and so on. Not quite multi-threading, but still multi-processing within a single process.
All right. So what are you using to actually develop PHP?
Okay, so I can't say that I'm today really actively developing PHP. I'm working with people that well, I'm guessing that this question is ambiguous. What am I using to develop, or what was I using to develop PHP itself, as in the language? In that case, I was using back then Visual Studio and Vim. Those are the two key tools that I was using. If you're talking about what I was using to actually develop PHP applications, then the other things that I didn't develop that many PHP applications. I was more into developing the infrastructure for PHP. But when I did, it was mostly either Vim or Zen Studio. Hope that answers the question.
Okay. How do you feel about the future of PHP, given all of the new languages and frameworks that are coming out?
So I think, honestly, I think today we have one big competitor, and that's JavaScript. It's not that, I'm not discounting the other languages, but the other languages, I think they too are threatened to a degree by JavaScript. JavaScript has this unfair advantage, as they call it, of being a language that pretty much any web developer needs to be aware of anyway. And if you're already aware of it, then why learn a new language for the backend? I personally still think that the PHP execution model for most web applications is easier to understand and easier to maintain than, say, Node.js. And I think that at least for the foreseeable future, there's appear to be a lot of people that agree with me. It doesn't mean that the Node execution model isn't interesting, and I just a few slides back admitted that we are going to copycat it to a degree, or try to anyway. But I think that ultimately it's a huge world, and there's definitely room for more than one language. There's actually room for more than 2 or 5 languages. And as much as pretty much at any point in time, there were always languages that people said, okay, that's it, PHP is doomed because everyone is going to start using Python, everyone is going to start using Ruby on Rails, and so on. Even though a lot of people are going to and are using JavaScript and Node, PHP is still growing, and it's still extremely, extremely popular. It has, and it's powering a huge part, a huge subset of the foundations of the web. So I don't see it going anywhere.
Cool. What are your thoughts on the value of becoming a Zen certified PHP developer?
You know, trying not to be biased. I mean, for those of you who don't know, I'm the CTO of Zen, so I am by definition biased. But trying to be as objective as I can. I think that there are some companies that would consider this to be a huge advantage, especially the larger ones. I think there are some companies, if it's in a startup, it may be less of a, it may matter less for them, and they would probably just give you a test to see if you're the ninja coder that they want you to be. All in all, I've definitely found a lot of, I've definitely come across a lot of people that were thankful that they did it and mentioned how it helped them get a job. That is primarily, that's the primary value of being certified. It does obviously force you to learn and know PHP at a certain level, but ultimately the main thing for this, as it is with pretty much any other certification, it's something that you can put on your resume, and then the person at the other hand know that they're dealing with someone who has at least this basic, not basic, but at least this level of knowledge that they need to have. So it really depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. If it's boosting your CV, then it probably is useful.
Great, great, great. Okay, so we're out of time. Thank you so much, Zeev. That was wonderful.
There's a one more thing, and it's an unplanned one more thing moment, but for those of you who like PHP elephants, I did bring 3 here. If you want to, I have them at the backstage. I'm going to go quickly, grab them, and throw them as far as I can, which typically isn't very far, so.
You're going to go grab it?
One moment.
Okay.